Hey everybody, Honeybee Honey here. I'm here with the video on feeding your bees. So if you want to stay tuned, I'll teach you all about feeding bees, protein patties, and sugar syrup, honey, whatever. See you in a minute. Hey everybody, today, sorry it's been a long time since I had a video out here, but it's been really bad weather. I don't know if you can see in the background there's some snow and stuff, but it's been snowing, been cold. Anyway, I thought I would start a video today on feeding bees. So especially beginners have questions about the best method to feed bees. And so I want to cover a little bit of material. I'm only going to show you a couple of ways to feed them myself because I only use a couple really. But bees need, just like us, they need two sources of food. They need a protein source, they need a carbohydrate source. Protein, of course, is the building blocks as it is, you know, for us. For the bees, carbohydrate source is their energy source, their brain food, and it's what keeps them alive in the winter. Now, through most of the US anyway, protein isn't really a problem. Pollen comes out fairly often, early in the year, and stays fairly late in the year until we get our first frost, first killing frost anyway. Nectar, on the other hand, comes and goes because there are wind-pollinated plants where bees collect pollen from. And so pollen isn't usually a problem. And I want to explain the difference between pollen and bee bread. Bees actually feed on bee bread, which is a mixture of pollen, honey, bee saliva, and enzymes, and it actually is fermented from the they add water to it as well. So it's actually a fermented mix of pollen and honey and other enzymes. That's what bees feed their brood. That's what they eat, along with honey, of course. But it's bee bread. It's not pollen. So when we talk pollen patties, we're really talking about a substitute that's really not, the term substitute is kind of misleading. They're not really substitutes. They are emergency feeding really, or used to mimic pollen, but it's totally composed of different things. So bees don't eat pollen, they eat bee bread. It's totally different. Most of the time, in my experience, bees don't need pollen unless the beekeeper messed with the hive, and in which case you might have to feed them a pollen patty. So with pollen patties, a lot of beekeepers, especially newer ones, wonder if feeding them a pollen patty in the spring or in the winter is just a necessity, and I'm here to tell you it's not at all. In fact, I think in a lot of cases it does more harm than good. Winter patties have become something of a fad lately. You know, there were no such thing as winter patties and spring patties, you know, probably 10 years ago that I'm aware of. And believe it or not, the bees, when they go into winter, they know how much pollen they have and they know how much honey they have. And they, through attrition, they shrink the size of their colony to a size that they think they can handle through the winter, that they can support through the winter and build up in the spring. So it's on their available resources in the hive in the fall. Once the nectar dearth has come and the honey flow is over, we're going into winter, the temperature's getting cold, the days are getting short. That's when they basically kind of cull their hive. Of course, they pull out the drones and they decide, based on their available resources, what they're going to do over the winter. So if you give them a winter patty, you're upsetting the balance. You're giving them a protein source, and even if you give them syrup with it, as in a carbohydrate source, you've basically upset the balance in the hive. So they go through winter strong, but they use up a hell of a lot more resources than what they would have if they had a fixed, known food source going into winter, like a wild hive does. So winter patties, I think, do no good. I think that they winter with a lot of bees, and they use up more resources than they needed to, and bees kind of reset in the spring. Once you have that nectar, that first nectar flow from the dandelions and fruit trees in the spring, they've basically reset and now they start to expand. There are 3 situations, however, where a pollen patty might be a good thing. Those 3 situations, the first one is if you removed a frame of pollen or something from the hive, or split, took half of the hive away and noticed that you took a pollen frame, you look in the hive, there is no pollen, then it's a good thing to give them a pollen patty. Winter or spring, depending on the time of the year, it doesn't matter. And then the second thing is if you are migratory, if you're trying to build, if I'm in Colorado, and by the way, congratulations to the Denver Broncos, my favorite team, but they won the Super Bowl 2 days ago. Today's February 9th. But the second thing is if you're migratory. I'm in Colorado. If I wanted to go to the almond orchards in California and I wanted the bees to build up sooner than they would naturally do in Colorado, because spring comes earlier in California for the almond flow or whatever, then I would want to build my hives up to an unnatural level, a high level. Otherwise you don't get paid for your pollination services. So if you want bees to build up early in the spring so that you can split them, create packages, or take your bees, to California or wherever in the world you are, you want them to build up unnaturally strong early in the season, something that would normally cause a swarm, then you can use, pollen patties are used for that. The third instance I've already mentioned, which is if you're a queen producer or you're going to produce your own queens, packages, splits, sell them or whatever, you need bees to build up early so that you can send off the packages in the spring. A pollen patty is a good thing. Pollen patties are on the market. You can make your own. I use pollen patties, but very rarely. I use Mega Bee. But that's really all there is to pollen patties. You make them up, you stick them on the top bars, and the bees will take them in. Or in some cases, you'll notice that they're just taking them out of the hive. But that's it for pollen, really. And I don't feed it very often. I don't have any right now, and I'm not going to feed any today. But this is archive footage that I have of me putting a pollen patty on a hive here. And you can see what it is it's a Mega Bee patty that I made up. You buy Mega Bee in a powder, you mix it up with some syrup, and I added some actual real pollen to it too, and then put it in between some wax paper and set it on the hive. Now, the thing about pollen patties is that they're useful if you want to build a colony up. Now in this case, I have a split that I'm managing and I'm building it up, so you can do that. Here I'm cross hatching it. I'm just cutting little slits in it so that they can get access to the patty from the wax paper. But the real problem with pollen patties, especially feeding them over the winter, is that you kick things so far out of balance that if you don't stay on top of every hive, you'll have bees starving come spring because they overwintered with too big of a cluster. That's all there really is to it. The second source is a carbohydrate source. Now when you're looking at carbohydrate sources, you're looking at sugar syrup, you're looking at high fructose corn syrup, you're looking at honey. Those are your 3 main sources of carbohydrates that you're going to give to the bees. Now, if you only have a hive or 2, then you don't have the same resources somebody like me has with 50 hives out here. So if you have frames of honey, maybe a hive died. I'm gonna keep this smoker lit. Maybe a hive died, and you have frames of honey. So I had that happen, and I showed a video earlier in the season. Here's a frame of almost pure honey, and I have more in here. That is the #1 best way to feed your bees. Give them frames of sealed honey. Why? It's more natural. It's what they eat. They made it in the first place. The only thing I want to warn you about when doing methods like this is that when you take one frame from one hive and you put it in another, make sure that you know that that hive didn't die of American foul brood or some other contagion. So, frame of honey is the best way to feed your bees. If you don't have that, and most people don't, you can feed liquid honey only if it's never been heated before. If it's never been heated, then you're good. If it's been heated to more than 120 degrees, you actually kill the enzymes that are in the honey. And as the enzymes die, other reactions occur, and that creates an acid that's bad for your bees. It can kill them, or it can just make them sick. But that is a bad thing to have. So, okay, the next best method if you don't have honey or frames of honey is sugar syrup. You can go as much as 5 to 1 mixture, 5 parts sugar to 1 part water, or 4 to 1, 3 to 1, 2 to 1. The least you want to go is 2 to 1 in the winter. So when you're talking about feeding, there's two ways of, there's emergency feeding and then there's feeding, say for spring splits or packages or something like that. You're feeding your bees then for a different reason than you are in the winter. In the winter, which is right now, it's February 9th, so I'm feeding these 3 hives, and I'm going to show you 2 methods today, but this is emergency feeding in the winter. You want to make sure that you want to get ahead of the game. You want to feed your bees before it gets to a critical situation. So if they're light in the fall, feed them in the fall. Don't wait until March to see if they made it. So I've been feeding them for the last couple months. Every week or so I'll come up and change the cans out. I've got a quart can of syrup here that I use to feed. And then this is just an example. This is what's called an entrance feeder, a Boardman feeder. This is something you can use too. I'll talk about the different types of feeders here in a second. But sugar syrup is one of the safest and most reliable ways to feed your bees. Honey is the best. Sugar syrup is the safest and most reliable, aside from honey. And then there is high fructose corn syrup. Now, high fructose corn syrup, the bees their bodies seem to react to high fructose corn syrup the same way a human's body does. It doesn't really recognize it as a food or doesn't know what to do with it. And in the times past when I've fed high fructose corn syrup to my bees, upon other beekeepers' recommendations, what I found was a hive that was defecating all over. They got sick. They had they didn't get eczema, but they had diarrhea or dysentery because they got sick. Now, none of those hives ever died from it, but I would not recommend high fructose corn syrup for your bees or for yourself. So those are your 3 basic bets. Now let's talk about the types of feeders. There are hive top feeders that fit on top of the brood nest. So here I have the brood nest for these 2 hive bodies. This is just something that's around my feeder. So a hive top feeder would go where this syrup is right here, where this can of syrup is. A hive top feeder, what it does is it's basically a tub that sits on top of the hive right above the brood nest under the inner cover, and you fill it with syrup, and it's just a pool of syrup in there. They're messy, they drown bees, the bees have to break cluster to get to it, so it's not something they can just cluster under and feed on. And then of course if the hive dies, or if they quit taking the syrup and you go to take it off of them, it's just a mess. So hive top feeders are there. Certain situations you might want to use them. I would never use them. I've used them before, don't like them, like I said. But then when you go to pour the syrup in the hive top feeder, you drown bees that are down there trying to get syrup in the first place. So I wouldn't recommend those. Aside from that, there are frame feeders where they basically take the place of a frame or 2, and it's the same thing. You just pour syrup in there. That's better. It still drowns bees. The bees still have to break cluster to get to it, and it's still messy. So the same problems associated with a hive top feeder there as well, but not as bad. And at least it's in the hive. And then you have a Boardman entrance feeder. So this just fits in the entrance of a hive. It just fits in the entrance. You can see it's stacked here. This is for the deep side of your bottom board. This is for the shallow side. And it doesn't have the drowning problems associated with it, but the bees still have to break cluster to get to it. And it was made for beekeepers. So this sits outside the hive, it's exposed to the elements, but you can just pull it off, fill it up, and put it back on. So you pull the whole thing off, fill it up, you screw it back on, and then you put it in the hive. So it's convenient, and that's the nice thing about these feeders is they're convenient. But if you live in an environment like me, the problem is that the bees need to be able to cluster under the feeder. So the last feeder I'm going to talk about is the only one I use, which this can be a mason jar, just like that. I could use that if I wanted to. You can use a quart can, a gallon can, whatever. Just be sure that you have a sturdy inner cover to use it. What you're going to do with this feeder is you're just going to set it on top of the bee escape hole. Now, of course, the bee escape hole is for, see how the bees are right underneath there? They're clustered right under there, and they've grown accustomed to the can being on there over the winter, so their cluster is now basically right under it. That's where they're making their brood and everything. Can's completely empty, and you can see it's pretty easy on a warm day. Now, on a day where it's not so warm, you can actually just do a little shuffle there, but you can squish bees that way a little bit, so I prefer to do it this way.
Turn the feeder upside down until it stops dripping before you place it on the inner cover.
Then you just set it on the hive, and of course, you know, it's going to stay full until they draw honey out of it. Disadvantage of using this method, you have to have a honey super or a hive body to put on the outside, just like so. And you can't get bees trapped in here, so you have to cover up that whole bee escape hole, because if they get trapped up there, they may not be able to get back out. But you do have to have this extra piece of equipment. Of course, it's something you already have anyway. So it's not really a disadvantage to me. But with this method, the bees can cluster right under it. You know, in the winter, it will not freeze. A lot of people think that syrup will freeze. If you have a gallon can, some of it might start to freeze. But if you have a quart can, the warmth of the bees' bodies is going to keep that can in a liquid state. So it won't freeze. And they'll be able to draw it out, and you can see that can was empty, and it's been cold here. It was 15 degrees this morning, it's 60 now, it's almost 60 now. It's a 45-degree difference in the last 6 hours. And that's the way the weather is here in Colorado. We have a saying in Colorado, if you don't like the weather, we'll just wait 15 minutes. Now this hive over here, I'm gonna use the other method. Now, I took over these bees from another beekeeper, and he used different equipment than I did. And basically he was real budget conscious, so he would buy the cheapest frames that he could find out there. You can see I recently changed these guys into new equipment. So this is my new equipment, but there were 3 frames in here that I know that I needed to exchange. So basically the bee space for the frames in his equipment, his frames are bigger than my frames just by a fraction of an inch, and it causes problems in bee space. So what I want to do is give these guys enough honey so that I don't have to feed them anymore, and use the best method that I have available, which is frames of honey. And so I'm gonna put those frames in here, and I'm gonna take out those old frames. So this is the best method to use when you want to feed bees, but not readily available to a lot of beekeepers. And of course, this isn't a hard thing to do. You can see that they were clustered underneath there. A little bit of syrup left in that can, it's still liquid. But this is the best, the actual best method to use to take care of a hive that doesn't have enough food. This is the best method to use. Now, of course, I didn't know I had those frames of honey for sure, and I searched them out the other day, and I found them. Otherwise, I would have done this before, because the bees did put some of that syrup in here. Now, when you're doing this, see, this is a pretty full frame, but I'm going to give them an absolutely full frame. When I'm done here. But the reason I'm doing this right here is mainly because these frames are larger than the frames that I'm using. And so what happens is they propolize the frames to the ones down below, given enough time, and they haven't had enough time in this hive to do it yet. But they will propolize them together, and then it just makes working the hive harder. So instead of doing that, what I'm doing is I'm pulling these three frames that don't match my frames out, and I'm replacing them with frames that are of my design and that have honey in them. So this frame has some honey on it, but not a lot. And what you want to do is make sure you don't get the queen when doing this. So the best way I think to do this, you get these solid frames of honey. This one has a lot of pollen in there, I'll give that to them. Is to get them all together and then shake the bees onto them. And try not to do that. This is solid honey. And another very solid honey frame here. So I know they've got 3 frames of honey, plus this one's solid too. So I know they got 4 to 5 frames of honey. You can see the cluster now. They were clustered right under that can, so you can see that. And basically that part of it's done. So now you just got to shake the bees off the frames. You usually give them a little bit of smoke on the frames and a little bit of smoke here to start driving them down. But you can see the cluster is good size. I hope. This one had a lot of syrup in it, so every time I hit the frame, some syrup flies out. And of course, the bees don't care much for being shook in this kind of weather. But haven't been stung yet or anything. Okay, and now I know this hive is healthy. I just changed them out into new equipment, so I know they're good anyway, but I know they're healthy, and you can pick up the back end. Pretty medium in weight now. So I'm just going to close them up, and I won't be needing to feed them from here on out because I just gave them 3.5, 4 frames of honey. So okay, so that's feeding your bees. Best method in my opinion is just a plain old can. You can get these for free a lot of times from paint stores. Plain old can, get them for free, punch a few holes in the top, set them upside down on a hive, on an inner cover that you already have, super that you already have. Bees can cluster underneath it. Good emergency feeding. I use it in the spring too. I don't change anything in the spring. One thing I may not have mentioned is that all those other feeders, the hive top feeders, the frame feeder, the boardman entrance feeder, all of them attract robbers. Bees can smell all 3 of those feeders, and hives start to get some robbing going on. This does not cause robbing. So I think I went over the advantages and the disadvantages pretty good. I really don't see any disadvantages to this type of feeding, except that you have to actually, you know, take the can off and set the other one down and go into the hive. But like I said, you can take 2 cans, and you can, if this is the feeder, you can get all the syrup out of this one and then just move this one and slide it over. But you do sometimes squish a bee or 2 that way because they're clustered right underneath that can. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it was informative. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the view. Thumbs up. Thanks.